A very commonly asked question comes my way more often than you think, and I've stated over the years, both in my written prose and my broadcast here on YouTube, that I still think, hands down, the best ever television news anchor in my book was Van Amburg. I don't think anybody's close. There's a few notables that you can put in the conversation, like Dave McElhatton, like who am I forgetting? I knew this always happens. Pete Wilson, of course. Pete Wilson. And then there's some people that you can also put in the conversation. Uh, uh, George Redding. Um, there's a few people. Um, I would venture to say Marsha Brandwin, but she was more of a secondary anchor. I'm talking about lead anchor. Van Amberg, in case you didn't know, Van Bay Area native, that born and raised in El Cerrito up in the hills, and died now about 15 years ago, was a very, very private person. And when he retired, he didn't do any interviews. I tried my best, and we almost got a positive feedback, maybe a note, but by then Van was not very into doing interview, which is and he was really nice about it. He didn't want to do interviews because he thought that it was the proper thing to do your bit and then leave. And I respect him for that. I guess he went into Johnny Carson mode. You may remember when Johnny Carson retired, he very rarely did interviews. Maybe I think he did a couple of Lettermans, but that's about it. So Van was private. The only interview he did give was on YouTube, and it was the interviewer was Dave McElhatton, who I thought was superb, just another absolute gentleman, a terrific Bay Area journalist out of San Francisco State, went from radio to TV, believe it or not. Usually it's the other way around. But McElhatton was more of a fatherly, kind of that certain type of style, more explanatory. Whereas Van Amberg was straight news. And he put Channel 7 on the map. But he had a lot of ventures before he went to Channel 7. And it was him and Jerry Jensen and Peter Giddings who did the weather. Jensen was the secondary anchor. And of course, John O'Reilly did sports. But as far as news is concerned, again, this is an opinion. But I think I have a lot of significant ammo to procure to you as to why I believe Van Amberg was the best. And today, nobody even comes close, particularly at Channel 7. There's anchors all around that are still around New York, Chuck Scarborough, and L.A., Jim Williams, who I think is very underrated. Um, but Amberg was, let's face it, one of the best. And he catapulted Channel 7 into that area where not only did they kill in the ratings, and they destroyed the competition. I mean, the only people that were in relevance back then, and I'm talking 70s, 80s, early 90s, was Cron. KPIX was just starting to come into focus, and Fortunately, Dave Mackle hadn't graced their airwaves. And they had, of course, some prominent other anchors like Wayne Walker on sports, Joel Bartlett did the weather. Bartlett would soon, years forward, join KGO TV. But we're talking about anchors here. And Van Amburg was the quintessential news anchor. And he was responsible for KGO. They were regarded as numero uno and just damn quite successful. The ratings were unbelievable. Ratings were bigger than some of the network shows, and that catapulted Channel 7 into the very top. This was a station that built its reputation on what they call happy talk. So, yes, it was a lot of if it bleeds, it leads. And the formula was just people who knew what they were talking about. It was an entertainment vehicle, even though it wasn't supposed to be. And they all had style and they all had a personality and they were conversational. They being the news team of Jensen, Amburg, Peter Giddings, and O'Reilly. And it was successful. News scene was a huge endeavor and it made a lot of money, and it was happy talk with a lot of extra fillings. But there was no argument. Van Amburg was the leader. And of course, back then in the 70s, particular, when Channel 7 started its supreme situation, you had Patty Hearst, you had the Zebra Killers or the Zebra Killings, you had all the various, somewhat tawdry, somewhat, talk about TMZ-ish, tabloid-ish situations taking place in San Francisco, which fed KGO's appetite as a happy talk site. And it was no other better illustrated than the rapport between Van and Jerry Jensen, and to a more than prominent element, Peter Giddings. And of course, today, you wouldn't even have that, an ounce of that taking place. First of all, it was four white guys. And today, you have a woman, you have to have somebody ethnic, and you have to have, it's totally different. And this was, mind you, in the era where there's no internet. But these actors, these players, and they were very serious about their journalism. They were entertaining as all hell. And you had these major stories, as I mentioned, Patty Hearst and the zebra killings. And you had all the frivolity and all the activity, some of it quite incredibly funny, sad, tragic, going on in San Francisco. I mentioned, obviously, the SLA and Patty Hearst. There was a lot to talk about back then. It was quite a time. It was Channel 7 that not only, and Amber in particular, that they put out a great news product. It wasn't everybody's cup of tea. I know that. But it was damn entertaining. People watched. They had remarkable numbers. They had a following like you couldn't believe. And those of you that watched back then know what I'm talking about, or you may not even know. But Channel 7 was so huge. They cut commercials, long commercials, a Western themed commercial. And they had Van on a horse and Jerry Jensen and Peter Giddings. It was unique. Nobody could compete with them. Nobody was even close. And I remember they always used to be a talk. Well, Channel 4, Cron, really good newscasts. And they did have quality newscasts, quality people, but they couldn't compete with ABC Channel 7, or as they called it, Circle 7. Mind you, these were characters, and they all fit within each other's personality. Van had his laugh and his smirk. Jerry Jensen was the perfect secondary figure to Van. God, we can never forget Peter Giddings in his polka dot tie doing the weather. How many times did you see that marker come out? And Pete would go off on there's no such thing as a reliable 72-hour weather forecast. Remember, he used to talk about that all the time. They didn't have the computer models that they have today. But Pete was unique, and he did these little gimmicky kind of things, some of which were funny, some were not. But he was interesting, and you watched. And he made a great, great kind of a contemporary guy, almost a foil to Van Amburg, who, again, you don't want to miss and go on YouTube and just take a look at some of these stories that they covered, like Patty Hearst, like the Milk Moscone assassinations. And yes, as I mentioned, tragedy, but there were also some very, very triumphant and joyous things to talk about. The other day, I talked about 1975, what took place in the city by the bay, Halloween and North Beach and the Condor and Carol Dota and the streets of San Francisco. It was an innocent time, yet it was a wondrous time. Lots of things that happened. And Channel 7 was at the forefront of covering. And boy, oh boy, oh boy, did they have numbers. Big numbers, huge numbers, which was the reason, amongst many, the Channel 7 news anchor, Van and Jerry, were amongst the highest paid news anchors, getting a lot of money. A lot of money back then, a lot of money today. Pete Giddings making well over $300,000. That may not sound like a lot of money, but it was back then, would be today. And who could ever forget Pete and his polka dot ties and the filmers, the photographers at Channel 7 taking a picture of Pete skiing down, remember? Squaw Valley and the mountaintops. It was the ski report, and that was a big to-do. Or Pete's infamous The Letter from Home. Excuse me a moment. John O'Reilly, Mr. Playboy, did the sports. And his secondary anchor on the weekend, Carol Ivy, would fill in. One of the first women sports anchors on television news here in the Bay Area. But make no mistake, Van was the leader, and he was fantastic. He read well. He looked the part. He had the great name. His real name was Fred Van Amburg, but pretty soon dropped that and simply became known as Van Amburg. And in the 70s, Channel 7 was number one, almost eternal. And even as the years progressed, Van was huge. He once was so huge, ABC gave him about 5 producers. He made well over $1 million, easily making him the highest paid news anchor in the Bay Area. And he could talk, he could interview, he was a fantastic ad-libber. You watch today, these clowns, a lot of them are clowns. There's a few decent people out there. They don't even come close. Van embarrassed some of these people that would come up later on because they simply had no iota of the style, the panache, the personality, the passion that Van Amburg had. He had his detractors, of course he did. When you get that big, of course, they were very few, folks. Very few. He knew at an interview, he could, as I indicated a little while ago, he can ad lib and talk to anybody, whether it was a cop or a politician, some breaking news event. And again, with KGO, the tagline, which became an industry favorite, if it bleeds, it leads. And that was Channel 7. And there were a few people who didn't like that. They thought it was tabloid. They thought it was sensationalistic. There were so many diatribes and all that. Look, like me and others, thousands of others, it was entertaining. We didn't always have to or want to see the news presented in kind of a solemnness or depressing element. And boy, oh boy, were there stories that I mentioned a little while ago that were quite depressing and very melancholy. Channel 7 had a knack for presenting not only interesting newscasts, but they did it in a manner that was highly, highly entertaining. Hate to break it down like that, but it is, after all, about numbers. Van was passionate. He was insightful. He was fantastic. He had that great name, Van Amburg. And the pen, the pen in his hand. The pen in his hand. The split screen image of him talking to various newsmakers. I'll never forget the Monday before Thanksgiving, 1978. You had Van Amburg and Marcia Brandwood by his side, interrupting the Monday night movie on Channel 7. And that, of course, was the description of the first video images coming out of Jonestown, Guyana, where Jim Jones was involved in that horrific murder, was mostly murders, suicide, just horrible story that was taking place in Guyana. And then later on, we would all see, and our mindset was just incredibly, oh my God, these images coming out of Jonestown. Well, Van Amburg was right there talking about it, interviewing people, including the great radio reporter and Channel 7 correspondent, Peter Cleveland. Van was simply terrific. I don't have anything negative to say other than the fact that I wish he was going to be longer on the air. I wish that 1989 was his last kind of setup at Channel 7. And he left, and ABC lost a pioneer, a giant. For my money, no question about it. No doubt about it. Van Amburg, to me, still the very, very best, the king of Bay Area news anchors. And I'll remember him that always. Just a giant.